The Adventure of the Tulips on Ice. Written by Petr Macek, music by Daniel Barták, read by Jamie Marshall. The disparate array of expertise in numerous fields of human knowledge was one of the things that never ceased to fascinate me about my friend Sherlock Holmes. In some areas, his knowledge bordered on encyclopedic, while at others he groped like a novice. Yet, he continued to learn all his life. As I have doubtless recounted many times before, his chief field of study was chemistry. Indeed, our quarters at 221B Baker Street were full of various flasks, tubes, burners, and myriad other equipment that would put many a laboratory in Oxford to shame. In time, I became accustomed to the odours emanating from his kit in the drawing room, and after a most unpleasant blunder one morning, I began to take considerable care as to which jar I spooned my sugar from to sweeten my tea. Nor am I acquainted with anyone else who, merely by analysing a small heap of cigar ash that had fallen onto a hall rug, could with such certainty identify the mysterious visitor at Lord Strafford's manor house, promptly leading to the identification of his killer. A monograph Holmes had written on the subject had become quite well known even outside professional circles. Yet his interests reached far beyond this. He naturally had an excellent understanding of biology and anthropology and could almost outdo me in medicine. But surely none of this comes as a surprise to regular readers of the Strand magazine and the adventures of this paragon of modern criminal science. Recently, however, certain circumstances recalled to mind a case which was marginal in essence, and which I originally had no intention of putting on record, but on which I would presently like to demonstrate how capable Holmes was of impressing me time and again, even after years of collaboration. It occurred at a point when we had been residing at his farm in Cuckmere Haven in Sussex for some time, enjoying our retirement. Holmes was chiefly engaged in beekeeping, while I caught up on the piles of literature I hadn't had time to read during my hectic life. Precious little could draw us out of our contented rural shell. All the same, we could not refuse an invitation to celebrate the birthday of our dear Mrs. Hudson. By then, our former landlady of many years was living permanently with her younger sister, who cared for the good woman in her advanced age with the same solicitude that the landlady had bestowed on us for most of her life. Devotion seemingly ran in the Hudson family, and we could only hope that the proverbial art of cookery was also likewise hereditary. Fortunately, the ladies lived at no great distance, comfortably ensconced in the compartment of a local train which ran along the high cliffs of Dover before plunging into endless pastures crossed by meandering rivers. The detective and I guessed whether lunch would consist of beef or fish, the preparation of which our landlady had always excelled at. Holmes then opened a newspaper and dived into it with relish. It is a well-known fact that he adored tabloids, with all their passion, emotions, and scandals. On the other hand, he described my preferred Daily Telegraph as reading for staid intellectuals and found it utterly uninteresting. "That's no newspaper for ordinary folk," he would say. They live for events in their immediate proximity, while rags like that one scorn the everyday lives of the majority of this nation. Instead, they focus on geopolitics or squabbles in the House of Lords. Nothing could be further removed from our butcher on the corner. I had no intention of letting him spoil my regular ritual. Moreover, I found he was mistaken this time, because most of the newspapers were focused on the health of King Edward, who had come down with bronchitis earlier in the year in Paris, and the general opinion was that his condition was unfavourable. He had, perhaps, weeks to live, and nobody could be indifferent to the fate of the monarch, indeed of Great Britain, be they an intellectual or a cook. But there was no sense arguing with Holmes. Over the edge of the paper, I saw his bright eyes devouring each line with gusto. I could only surmise what he was reading from the headlines on the front page, which revolved almost masochistically around the case of Dr. Crippen, who had poisoned his wife and buried her body in the cellar of their London home, and the gas explosion at Wellington Colliery in Whitehaven that killed 136 people. Every now and then, my concentration was disturbed by Holmes's ejaculations, torn out of any comprehensible context. "They've only known each other a week," he exclaimed indignantly. Then a moment later, with some surprise, he observed that she couldn't have been that old. I had just been reading the obituary of the Italian painter Francesco Monaccesi, who had succumbed to a protracted illness in Rome at the age of 93, and recalling our journey to the Italian capital, when the exasperated detective finally sought my attention directly. "Behold, Watson, this is precisely what I mean," he exclaimed, shoving an article from the paper under my nose and demanding attention, heedless of my annoyance. "A series of robberies among small tradesmen across the country. The loot is never big enough to excite the police inspectors or local government, yet it is devastating to the victims. But since there is no promotion to be gained from such minor investigations, and more than a year remains until the municipal elections, the authorities are lax. But locals, fearing for their livelihoods, ending up in the poorhouses with their entire families, is not plump enough a morsel for your illustrious Times." Indeed, a fairly large section of one of the tabloids was filled with the lamentations of a baker, a confectioner, and a tobacconist for whom the stolen sales meant existential difficulties. The modus operandi was always the same. There were always two assailants, one of the smaller stature, the other bulky, who lay in ambush, waiting until the victim was quite alone. The only mitigating circumstance was that they left no corpses. "I should think it's understandable," I retorted, "at least in terms of journalistic approach. Why, the major newspapers cannot possibly concern themselves with every minor incident, of which there must be hundreds across the nation, which is precisely what makes them a topic for those local journals." I shrugged, putting away the newspaper. "But I agree that the disregard on the part of the authorities is reprehensible." Holmes snorted angrily, as always when the conversation turned to the abilities of the state police. With some rare exceptions, he considered the members of the force to be an incompetent lot, often impeding rather than aiding investigations with their idiocy. He had little patience, even for the legends of Scotland Yard, honoured with a Victoria Medal, like Lestrade or Phibbs. "It is sheer incompetence," he fumed. His grey brain cells, accustomed to activity, unable to rest when presented with a problem until they'd solved the puzzle, must have been suffering. "Where is the analysis of the clues at the scene? Where are the informants? The culprits must be disposing of their loot with dealers and usurers. They should have been questioned and stopped long ago." I could hardly object to any of this. and we spent the remainder of the journey in silence. A short time later, we were standing on the platform of a small village railway station, with clouds of steam billowing around our legs. It was not far to the Hudson house from here, but I was not inclined to walk. I noticed Holmes looking about, curiously. "Are you looking for a cab?" I asked with relief that we were of one mind. "Well, surely we can hire one in front of the inn." Yes, Watson, I know. But I realized something else. We cannot arrive empty-handed." I raised my eyebrows in surprise, for I knew the detective had a neatly wrapped parcel in his case containing a stunning brooch from one of London's finest jewellers, and I had assumed the cake would be homemade. "Why, flowers, my dear fellow. As proper gentlemen, we cannot arrive without them." He read my mind, replying before I could put my thoughts into words. We stepped out in front of the station building, where a book peddler and an aged florist were vying for the attention of the arriving passengers. The florist's offerings appealed to neither of us, as the blooms were wilted, surely at least a day old. It would not have surprised me had they been stolen from a nearby graveyard. Besides the hawkers and the passengers, the only other person in the area, which expanded into a square, was the local constable with reddish whiskers. At first glance, judging by his military bearing, I guessed him to be a war veteran. He peered suspiciously at every stranger passing by and encroaching on his territory, meanwhile greeting the locals by briefly tapping 2 fingers to his tall helmet. Under his hawkish gaze, we strolled into the town and headed down one of the narrow streets in the hope of finding a nicer flower shop. The constable continued to observe us for a moment, and then started on his rounds, pacing slowly. We ascended a gentle slope along a paved alleyway and walked down the high street. There were few passers-by as lunchtime approached. Housewives were busy with preparations, and their husbands were at work during the morning hours. The streets would become livelier again in the afternoon and evening, while the local elite emerged for their obligatory stroll. Gentlemen would tip their hats, and ladies, behind a facade of cordiality, would observe each other with sneering expressions, seeking reasons for a later bit of gossip. Our eyes fell on a small, charming flower shop with a painted signboard proclaiming that we were at Roses. Displayed on the pavement in front of the store, beckoning to customers, were fresh tulips about to bloom, their cupped buds protected from the sun by a canvas awning, lilting in the mild breeze. I inhaled their scent with delight, admiring the bright colours, and followed Holmes inside, where our presence was announced by a subtle tinkle of a bell above the door. The detective looked around curiously with a murmur of satisfaction. The shop was permeated by a heady mix of floral scents, which assaulted our senses with full force. In the midst of the plethora of fresh flowers stood a sales counter with a few strips of straw for tying bouquets and a pair of garden shears. It was tidy and cosy, but neither Rosie nor anybody else was present to attend to us. "Is there anyone here?" Holmes called out, taking a few steps toward the rear door of the shop, which led through the house and apparently on into the garden. When there was no reply, the detective tried again, while I started browsing the selection. Mrs. Hudson preferred potted plants to cut flowers, and I had already started picking out pansy bushes with my eyes. Finally, there was a rustle at the back, and a door slammed, followed by several footsteps, and a petite young lady with her brown hair pulled back trotted into the shop. She was attired in athletic dark trousers with an apron and was carrying a bunch of fresh, bright yellow daffodils. "My goodness, you gave me a fright," she explained on seeing us. I hadn't heard you come in. I was working in the greenhouse, and the door must have closed on me. Not many customers come in at this hour, she apologized. She laid the daffodils on the counter and started shortening the stems with scissors to put them into a vase. What can I do for you, gentlemen? She asked sweetly while working. We need a bouquet for a certain lady, said I, returning her smile. Given Holmes's disdain for such social niceties, I took the initiative. It was far from unpleasant, as she appeared to be a very nice young woman. Had I not been her father's age, I might not have resisted the temptation to flirt. Then you're in the right place, she chirped. You need only ask, is it for a special occasion? We can also choose the flowers based on the lady's age. As she prattled away, she divided the cut daffodils into 2 bunches, adding each to a vase with other flowers that best matched in colour. Holmes, leaning casually against one of the wooden columns in the room, gazed at the girl with animated interest and examined her from head to foot. He did so very inconspicuously, without her noticing, but knowing him as intimately as I did, I perceived the change in his manner at once. A shop like this must require quite an effort, he interjected. But I have to say you must be proud of it. Your flowers are truly first class. Why, thank you, sir, she blushed. My shop means the world to me. I do my best. Perhaps you could help me with something, he mused. You see, no matter what I do, the sunflowers from my garden never last long in a vase, while yours, he pointed to one of the vases in the shop window, are still beautiful. Might you have any advice? They are sunflowers, sir. You need only place them in the sunlight and keep them watered, of course, she chimed laughingly, pleased with her praise. I myself never noticed sunflowers in our drawing room to be suffering. Indeed, I had never noticed any there at all, so I preferred to smile politely and waited to see what would come out of Holmes's little charade. Several moments of profound silence followed. Oh, how interesting, my friend then replied, now visibly fixing his sharp gaze upon the girl. She, in turn, became quite nervous suddenly and made it apparent she was in a hurry. Well then, have you chosen the flower? I wouldn't like to press you, but it's almost time for my lunch break. She cleared her throat meaningfully and took several steps towards the door. I'm afraid there will be no deal. Holmes shook his head slowly and folded his arms. Then I shall thank you. You may see yourselves out, she retorted, her demeanour likewise altered. I hadn't the faintest idea what was going on and why the mood in the room had cooled so suddenly. Had the girls said something to anger my friend? Why were they observing each other with such hostility? Do stop this charade, Holmes snorted in disgust, grasping the girl by the wrist. She struggled to wriggle free, and for a moment it looked like she might bite him. Let me go! How dare you! By what right? I will call for the police! She fumed, as a nasty grimace crept over her lovely countenance. I was unsure whose help to come to, and was still searching for the cause of their behaviour. That is a brilliant idea, miss, Holmes concurred. Without troubling to explain a thing, he turned to me with icy calmness. Watson, please be so kind as to fetch the constable. The whiskered officer who was observing us at the train station started off to the northeast, and judging by his gait, I expect you should run into him if you walk 2 blocks to the left from here and then turn right. Before I could obey, a tall man with a leather sack hurtled in from the back room. He wore a knitted black cap, pulled down over his eyes, for which he had cut out round holes. His eyes were malicious. I feared he might attack us, but he was clearly attempting to make an escape instead. "Harry, you scoundrel! You're not going to leave me here!" the salesgirl hissed. Harry, the scoundrel, ignored her and scrambled for the door to the street. Holmes, without releasing his grip on the squirming wildcat, merely extended one leg to the side and knocked over an iron rod used to pull down the awning, directly into the fugitive's path. The long pole became entangled in the man's legs, and the inertia of his forward dash threw him straight into the wall, and entirely out of action without our further assistance. The detective rarely resorted to violence, but in this case, physics had done the job. At that very moment, the street door flew open. "What the devil is going on here?" thundered the constable, whom I was supposed to have sought out. His astonished eyes darted from the concussed burglar to me, then to Holmes, and then the salesgirl. Taking advantage of the girl's stunned stillness, the detective reached into her apron pocket. "Excellent. You have spared Dr. Watson the journey," he said, pleased. "If you pass through to the greenhouse in the rear, you will find the owner of this shop bound up there. In the sack on the floor, you will also find the money belonging to this poor woman, whom this fine pair of burglars have ambushed. That is, unless this young lady wishes to keep claiming that she is Rosie. She might even explain what this particular piece of headgear is for," he said, pulling a small black hood from her apron, similar to the one on the man's head. Triumphantly, he released the girl from his iron grip, for she had nowhere to run. "That certainly isn't our Rosie O'Hara." The officer scowled at the now subdued woman, readying his handcuffs. "I know everyone in my district." It all came to pass just as Holmes had predicted. The police released the bound-up Rosie, who had suffered nothing but a gruesome shock, and all the money was restored to her. In return, the grateful florist rewarded us with a truly luxurious bouquet for Mrs. Hudson. By now, the reader will surely have gathered that Holmes had, with luck, broken up that dangerous pair of robbers who, according to the tabloids, had been the terror of the entire neighbourhood. We remained on the scene for a few minutes more until the constable's reinforcements arrived. "The only thing that eludes me is how you happened to be in the right place at the right time," Holmes inquired of the officer. "I saw you alight from the train, and there was something familiar about you," the good man admitted. Holmes smiled condescendingly. He often feigned disinterest in worldly fame, even declaring that his reputation as the world's greatest detective annoyed him. But I suspect that was a mere act. "Indeed it is I," he said, drawing a card from his breast pocket with his name embossed on it in glossy script. "Sherlock Holmes." The constable gazed at him in astonishment. "I beg your pardon, sir, but I was not speaking of you," he said, turning to me. "It was your colleague who looked familiar. Are you not Dr. Watson, John Watson, who saved my life in Kandahar?" I had indeed once served as an assistant surgeon with the 5th Northumberland Rifles, but so many wounded soldiers had passed into my hands that I could hardly remember them all. The local constable must have been one of them. It was only later that Holmes explained precisely what had occurred in the flower shop. It was obvious to me practically from the moment she walked in that the young woman could not have been the true shop owner, he recounted, sniffing at a tulip bud he'd plucked from the pavement and inserted into his lapel. "This shop belongs to a young lady who knows her trade. Yet the intruder behaved like an elephant in a china shop." I was surprised, for I had observed nothing of the kind myself. Naturally, Holmes noticed my confusion and took a long pull on his pipe to ignite it. Flowers, my dear Watson, like all living things, require a specific approach. Only an amateur could think that they need to be plucked or cut and put in a vase. Such a flower would not last long. It would swiftly wither and, so to speak, die. The real Rosie knows this, of course. He set about explaining. I eagerly devoured his every word. Had you noticed the tulips near the entrance? Well, of course you did. I saw how keenly you were looking at them. You unconsciously rubbed your hands together, for a chill came over you. Do you know why? Because there were blocks of ice in the bucket with the flowers. For freshly cut flowers last longer if they're kept cool. He was right, of course, as far as my feelings were concerned. The detective blew out a puff of smoke indulgently and continued. It was this detail that persuaded me to visit the particular flower shop. I was certain we could procure a much finer bouquet here than those offered by the poor woman at the train station. Every vase in the room suggested that the proprietor knew what she was doing. He motioned around the room with a sweeping gesture. Take those roses. See how much water they have. He pointed to the counter, almost to the brim. This is because rose stems are woody and need more of it, unlike, say, gerberas, which must be given very little water, he added, looking around. Just as I thought, Rosie did not disappoint. He rejoiced, holding up a vase with a bright medley of ornamental yellow, red, orange, and pink star-shaped blossoms. Indeed, only a few inches of water were reflected at the bottom of the vessel. I'm afraid I still don't understand what gave the thief away. I pondered, unsure where he was headed. All this had been set up well before our arrival. The thief failed in every aspect I observed, he shrugged. Even if I were to attribute a single thing to chance or the girl's absent-mindedness, the rest simply could not be explained otherwise than we were face to face with a fraudster. Holmes, don't keep me in suspense any longer, I cried impatiently. As usual, Holmes was enjoying the volubility with which he explained his thought processes to me as an obtuse simpleton. Why, it's elementary, my dear Watson. You live in nature's bosom, yet you have still learned nothing from our gardener, he laughed dryly. First off, I was struck by the daffodils. She must have picked them up hastily as a prop when she hurried into the shop to stop us from proceeding into the back rooms, for Rosie was lying there, bound up and guarded by the thief's accomplice Harry, and it was of the essence that we not see them. What was so special about the daffodils? Nothing about the daffodils as such, but the impostor put them in a vase with other flowers without a moment's hesitation. No proper florist will do that. Every expert knows that the stems of daffodils produce a fluid, a kind of sap, which is harmful to other plants, meaning they must be displayed separately, I understood. Yes, at least for the first few hours after being cut, until the sap leaks out. So the sunflowers were just a test. Quite so. To make her betray herself entirely by advising me to put them in the sun and to give them water. An experienced florist would know that sunflowers must be immersed in boiling water for 5 to 7 seconds to expand the veins, allowing the plant to absorb more water. Where in heaven's name did you get this knowledge? Well, merely by observing the world around us, my dear fellow. Incidentally, you might have noticed something suspicious yourself, despite your ignorance of floriculture. What do you mean? It might have struck you as odd that although the woman claimed we had disturbed her while working in her greenhouse, she had no soil on her hands. Even more so that her nails were clean and lacquered, and her skin entirely unblemished. Nobody who is constantly in contact with thorns, vines, and twigs has hands like that. As always, it all seemed so simple. Once Holmes explained it. We bade the constable and Rosie a cordial farewell and took a cab to the Hudsons, who had surely been awaiting us eagerly. The incident was promptly forgotten, for in our lives full of criminal masterminds, cunning swindlers and deceitful murderers, it was a mere morning's trifle. For the rest of the journey, over the rattling carriage wheels, Holmes engaged in something else. A lecture on why a fly, because of its compound eyes, perceives space differently, and is thus often unable to find its way out of the open window through which it has entered. He only fell silent at lunch when an exquisite trout was served.